Hi, everyone. You can hear me all right in the back row? Don? Good. Well, excited to be here this morning to talk about the question of why Charlie's a tall act to follow. It was like listening to a thesis, but really coming out with some awesome insights as a result. So a little humbled to be here this morning, and especially honored to have Kelly Wright here. Kelly Wright is co-anchor of America's News Headquarters, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Fox News. He's also previously was the co-host of Fox News and Friends Weekend. And he, in those capacities, and also as anchor and reporter in regional markets, he has covered major international and domestic events, including Abu Ghraib, 2004 elections, as well as the handover of U.S. sovereignty in Iraq. So we are just extremely excited to have him here today. He began his career as a U.S. Army reporter. He also is a musician and an artist. So we have a lot to talk about, and too little time to do it in. So just by words to just organize the time. We'll probably go 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And just feel free to interject with any questions you might have. And I'm Jared Daugherty. Got it up there. Who am I? I'm a 3 in Dartmouth speak. I graduated in 2003. I was a Nation Studies major, music minor. Always really glad to get back to Hanover, and just love the Wheelock Conference and everything that it represents here. And so, happy to moderate the discussion. So, just to kick off the time together, Kelly, it seems to be fitting this morning to ask you, what is your why? If you had a mission statement for your life, what would it be?
That's a great question. First of all, I want to thank everyone for inviting me to be a part of this incredible conference. I'm delighted to be here and excited to see what's going on here on the campus of Dartmouth. And I will tell you that this is my first visit to Hanover, New Hampshire. Of all the places I've traveled, I've been to Manchester, New Hampshire to cover the New Hampshire primaries and some of the debates that were going on basically during 2004. And so now getting back to your question, why? I'm glad you asked that, because the reason why I do what I do is because of my faith and my hope and my love for God and for service to humanity. Now, that sounds very lofty, but anytime you talk about that being your reason why, you understand there's a lot of sacrificial a lot of sacrifice involved in that, not just in terms of education, making sure you get a solid education so that you can actually go out and intelligently and intellectually talk about what you're doing and defining your role. But there's also the education in terms of the spirit. I'm a graduate of Oral Roberts University. I was taught with the whole person concept, mind, body, and spirit. The mantle was put upon us that we should go where the light is dim. And what better place to go where the light is dim than the news media? Because we certainly have some dim, dark days that we're reporting on. And a lot of times, many of you who are watching the news, regardless of what you're watching, at the end of the day, if you're constantly watching that news 24/7 and you're being bombarded with that news, chances are you're scratching your head and say, why am I so angry? Why am I filled with so much angst? Why is there so much uncertainty? Why? And why? You're just going off the deep end, even though you might have graduated from Dartmouth or be a student here now. You just say, scratching, what in the world is going on? So my reason for the why was to bring a little bit of hope, a little bit of faith, a little bit of love, and season the world with some light in darkness, and to season our hearts and our minds with some hope where there's despair. I mean, I think Charles eloquently spoke about what happens when a person is in despair. They see themselves as being meaningless. And from my background, from I'm the proud product of a single parent mother who actually taught me and instilled in me that I should always have a hunger and a thirst for living my best life now. So this is my why. And it's funny because I put on my Facebook the other day, I put on a picture of myself and I asked the question, what does God require of us? And then why? And so I pose that to each and every one of you here today. As you leave, ask yourself, what does God require of me? And then can you answer the why? So I hope I'm explaining myself very, very well. And then you talked about music. I have a musical project called Love, Freedom, and Peace. And in that, there's a line from my title track, What's Your Thing? Love, Freedom, and Peace. I guess it could have been, why is it your thing? Because in that, I say, my thing is love, my thing is freedom, my thing is peace. What's your thing? So that's my why, to spread love, freedom, and peace. And hopefully, by the time I end here today, you'll be saying, that's my why, love, freedom, and peace. Okay.
Thanks, Kelly. I mean, I really appreciate, we were talking a little bit yesterday about finding those stories of hope that inspire in the midst of darkness and sort of using that as a way to really season what goes out on the airwaves and provide extra texture to the news stories. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about some of those. Specifically, I mean, can you describe some critical junctures in your career, maybe even in your life, and just describe, how those junctures shape why you do what you do?
Well, again, it goes back to how I was raised and the unusual circumstances in which I was born. Without going through a long story, I'm a product of courage. My mother was raped, held that to herself for many, many, many years, including through the pregnancy. She was only 16 years of age. And she was offered a chance to get rid of the child through an abortion. And she told the person who happened to be my grandmother, I'm not going anywhere. God is telling me this is the only child I'll ever have biologically. And as a result of that, she was a defiant 16-year-old, very precocious, very intelligent, and had a dream and an aspiration of becoming a psychiatrist. And 5 days after her 17th birthday, she gave birth to me. And while she didn't pursue her ultimate dream of becoming a psychiatrist, she sure was a good one for me. Because she kept me very level. And there are many days that I miss her. She passed in 2005. And I miss her wisdom, and I miss her intense love for me, and her ability to speak to my heart and speak to my mind. So there were certain junctures that happened after that unusual circumstance, and I still, someone related to my story as my being a product of rape. And that sounds so disgusting and disturbing to me. I really take issue with that because I'm really a product of courage and of love. So every juncture that I've been through in life, rather than looking at the circumstances as folding and caving in on me, I go back to what my mother used to say, June. She said, look, you're always a part of the solution. Never allow yourself to be part of the problem. So at junctures like through school, when I was just the only child, single parent, living in Washington, D.C. or Hagerstown, Maryland. I lived in both places. And when attacks would come against me and people would make me feel bad because I was trying to be intellectual, and so I was the odd kid out sometimes, I really felt put down. And I didn't know how to deal with that or grapple with that. I didn't know how to deal with the insults, the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune, as Shakespeare used to say. But what I learned to do is that at every juncture, I went back to what she was saying, be part of the solution. And that happened not only in my personal life, but then it began to happen in my professional life. And even now, it's happening in my professional life, which I will not discuss right now because it's a situation not for our topic. But at every juncture, every critical juncture where there's a major decision has had to be made, I've gone back to what June said. June is my mom. And that is, I've gotten on my knees to pray and prepare for that day and prepare for that task and that impossible task. Because I've learned through life that I'm not capable of doing the impossible. So I need God to help me help myself. Because if I'm not careful, I'll get in his way. And then I'll block his way from leading me to a better way.
I love that. Sort of growing out of those roots, let me switch attention a little bit to journalism. You have spent a long career as a reporter, as an anchor, as a host. You mentioned some of the highlights earlier, but journalism has changed. I mean, when we think about, I don't know if you saw the Post, with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, and that is, this is an iconic setting, in American journalism. And now we think about, how you can beat Twitter or Facebook to, the latest scoop. So the question for you, I guess, is what was the role of journalism in, American public life and public life when you started? And how has that role changed? And I don't think that gets too far from what Charlie was talking about earlier, because, we talk about the different narratives of which we're a part. And journalism has this role in the American story. And you've had a unique insight and perspective on that. So if you could just describe a little bit about, just how has the role of journalism changed? I think that'd be really helpful for us.
Well, my view of journalism actually goes back to the days of Walter Cronkite. I'm old enough to remember that. I'm old enough to remember 1963 when I was in school, just a little kid, and a news flash came on our closed circuit television in Hagerstown, Maryland, in Washington County, Maryland. And at that time, that was one of the pioneers in closed circuit television for our public school system. And the reality was that we were in a third grade class. Our teacher, Miss Gilmore, sat down and quietly said, I want all of you to take a seat, and we have to turn on the television. And we turned on the television, and it was the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a president that I was young, but always enthused about his presence because he has such a dynamic presence. Older now, he probably wouldn't have been elected as a Democrat because he would probably be more of a Republican today. Not that I'm picking sides here. But I remember that crystal clear because that was journalism. That's what really began to feed my appetite to become a journalist. Because Walter Cronkite, while he was emotionally moved, he was also thinking about the status and the state of America. And he spoke sincerely, deliberately, credibly, and emotionally, and yet intellectually. He put everything together. To me, he was a consummate journalist. And he actually settled America, even with his tears, when he announced that the president had passed. And then I watched that progression. And then I watched the stories about Martin Luther King Jr. I watched the stories about the civil rights struggle. I watched all those stories. I watched stories locally in Washington, D.C., where I saw some incredible news anchors who really cared about what they do and about their community. They were involved. I would see news anchors in my neighborhood. I met them. My mother was a men's hairstylist, so she knew a lot of the anchors, including going back to Willard Scott. She's the one who convinced Willard Scott to get a hairpiece. And when I finally met Willard, I said, yeah, you know my mom, June? Yeah, I sure do. And it was just amazing. So I watched these young journalists, and my mother was always concerned about what I would get my head wrapped around because I was always starstruck. I wanted to become a professional singer and an actor, and my mother would always resist that because she wanted me to really focus on getting an education first and not risk starving to becoming a starving artist. But she would introduce me to a lot of news anchors locally, Max Robinson, Fred Thomas. These guys are deceased now, but these were guys who were actually looked at me as a young child and said, Kelly, you have a vast view of the world at your young age, and there's an unlimited potential for you if you go into journalism. So I saw journalism back then as being almost like an activist, if you will, for improving not just my personal community, which was predominantly African American, but all communities, because I watched these guys do it, and then reaching out to that community because you were known for delivering news, you were also known for being able to deliver something beyond the news of the day by getting involved in community projects, civic projects, nonprofits, and helping to inspire and encourage people beyond the news. And so that was kind of my understanding of news. And then when I got into it, and it was like that, I watched it change when it became a moneymaker. I watched it change when people realized there's money in this. And I watched everyone begin to not only embrace news for the essence of giving good information and analysis and insight, and all of those things that are important for us. When we pick up a newspaper and we go to the editorial page, we're looking at what the editorial or what the opinion is of certain people, so we can actually go through those facts and make some intellectual decision about ourselves of how we conduct our lives. But then when money got involved, I mean big money, and politics got involved, it began to change. And then when some of the things after, I would say after Richard Nixon, is also when I saw it change, because we became more intrusive as journalists. Privacy was off the table, and we were more intrusive about going through everything that you would do, which is one of the reasons why I never ran for Congress, because you give up so much of your privacy. And then when wars took place, the Vietnam War actually brought news into a different perspective. I've covered war. It's not a pretty picture. The Vietnam War was a very difficult, painful time period for our lives. And we saw a lot of social upheaval as a result of that in our nation. And so I thought I wanted to be in the center of it. I wanted to be at the pulse of it, to be able to at least try to bring, as I said earlier, my why, to bring some faith, some hope, some love, some salt, and some light in that darkness. And journalism has changed now, because now we're divided. We are answering the beck and call of the left, the beck and call of the right, and if the left gets more extreme and the right gets more extreme, there are news agencies that get more extreme with them. And no one's coming into the middle. I explained it to Jarrett before in a conversation we were just having, casually. I said, Jarrett, if I was preaching in a church and I was talking about the essence of God's word, the Bible, I would have to realize that the audience in that church that I'm speaking to could be leaning left, could be leaning right, and I would have to tell them, it's amazing, you read the Bible and then you put a veil over it according to your political ideology. So when you read that, are you really taking the truth of what God is saying? Or are you then putting a veil over it with your conservative politics or your liberal politics? And news, my friends, is the same way. We're looking at the truth, yet we're shading it with the left is responsible for this, the right is responsible for this, Republicans, Democrats, and no one's meeting in the middle except when we have a tragedy. That's the wrong time to be concerned about truth. It is more important to me as a journalist to be concerned about truth at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. As Charles was talking about, we're part of a narrative, we're part of a story. And I'll go one step further, as he talked about. I will agree with him that we're part of God's story. And if we're not willing to stand up and talk about that, we have a problem. So news has changed in the sense that I think it's become too fragmented, too divided, and we need to get right back in the middle, bringing people together as opposed to causing them to have more division. You know, I hear so much about fake news, and some of the fake news is the fact that we're fake. We're not being true to ourselves. if we're constantly chasing that almighty dollar that boosts our ratings, so we provide more controversy, more confrontation, rather than more conciliation and bringing people comfort, peace of mind. Remember, my thing is love, freedom, and peace. There's a reason for that. I'm not Pollyannish, but I just realized that in the middle of negative news, there's also someone out there doing something positive, going against the grain. Some of you Dartmouth students, some of you graduates, you've gone out there, you've gone against the grain. Who's telling your story? There's a few of little old me's out there who are trying to find your story and tell it, because we realize that the world needs it. But hope is such a tough thing to market these days. And news always left me with hope when I was a younger kid, growing and a younger journalist. And nowadays, I see people turning off their TV sets and they are angry because some news anchor or some opinion person has just put them to bed with a mood of hostility rather than a mood of, there's hope for tomorrow.
Really well said. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that question of faith and how to be a good journalist, because I think that Christ has this call to every believer for public evangelism, to make disciples. And how do you think about that in light of your journalistic profession? Like, is the profession at odds with that? Because journalism is, like you said at the beginning, Walter Cronkite, dispassionate, or is it? I don't know. You can tell me. You're objective. There's a fine line to walk in terms of, ethically, journalistic ethics. I mean, and how do you think about Christ's call in terms of your journalistic profession? Is it possible to be a good journalist and to be a faithful follower of Christ? And also, in answering that, if there are folks where you said, these people really helped me, Christian or not, to really understand how to be a Christian journalist, could you just share a little bit of that, maybe about the context
Sure.
which they have?
Well, the first question, the short answer is yes, you can be a Christian or a believer in the news media. Is it difficult? Yeah, it's difficult. Will there be scars? Of course. Will people kind of look at you and like, I'm not really getting him? Yes, that happens too. Is it worth it? Absolutely. 100% worth it. Let me say that again. It is 100% worth it to be who you are. I have a friend who has recently really influenced me to catch on to this phrase. She is my publisher. She would say, be unapologetically you. And it's funny because a lot of times as Christians, we're constantly apologizing. And I have learned that I'm not to use my profession when I'm on air on Fox News saying, hey, look, I know this news is bad right now, but let me just minister to you, friends. Let me tell you who can heal your broken heart. That wouldn't fly, because I have to respect the fact that my employer has me there because they believe in my ability to be an anchor and a reporter and to be objective and not to use it for evangelism. So, but there are these golden moments that happen. For example, my first story out of Baghdad, Iraq, in 2004. April 2004, I went to Baghdad, and I was very concerned about what was happening in this war. And my first story, I met this guy prior to going there. He was known as the Vicar of Baghdad, Andrew White. He was a canon. He is a canon of the Anglican Church. And Andrew had launched a campaign and a program to bring all people together. It was an incredible organization. It still exists today, although because of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and terrorism and what happened in Iraq after we left, he's no longer doing that. But getting to the point of this story, imagine, if you will, I'm landing in Baghdad, and we're concerned about any type of sniper fire or someone trying to lob some sort of rocket launcher RPG at us. And so we're doing a corkscrew landing. And I'm thinking, I've never done this before, but it's kind of thrilling and kind of scary at the same time. And we finally, before I know it, we land on the ground, and then I'm instantly taken in by my Fox crew and my security team. I'm given a flak jacket, a helmet. We get in an armored vehicle, and we drive to our hotel, and my bureau chief says, whatever you do not be on the streets alone. Don't leave the compound alone. So what does Andrew do? He picks me up and he takes me out alone. He says, I want to show you Baghdad, Kelly. and I'm thinking, well, I'm totally off the reservation now. I'm really in trouble here. And Andrew takes me to all these beautiful places. And he said, yeah, Saddam was building this mosque, and now we're really using it now so we can bring all people together, all faiths to come together. And he introduced me to the people of Iraq. I remember going into a dress shop, a men's dress shop, and there were guys with sidearms. I'm thinking, this is not good. Because I'm thinking, what I've seen on television about how bad it is, and I could get beheaded or get kidnapped. And Andrew is saying, Kelly, it's all right, God's with you. And so I'm a block away from where our compound is, and he says, okay, I'm going to go. He has his bodyguard with him. He says, all you have to do is walk around the corner. And he allows me to go. That was the longest block I've ever walked. I'm looking at all the sights and sounds of Baghdad. I'm thinking, at any minute, someone could take me out or do something. And then my first thought was, my bureau chief's going to be very angry if something happens to me. Well, I made it in. And then the next day, Andrew took me to this church, St. George's of Mesopotamia. I had my entire crew with me, my security team. It was a Sunday morning, and we go in, and the people are having church like we have here in America. Free, smiling, laughing. I'm from a charismatic background, and they're very charismatic and enthusiastic about their praise. And I'm looking at my camera crew, and they're looking at me, and we're saying, are we in Baghdad? Because we're in a church between two bombed-out buildings. We've forgotten about the bombed-out buildings. We have forgotten about everything except what's going on in that church. And I asked Andrew, said, what is the deal here? He said, I'll talk to the pastor. I spoke to the pastor. And he said, well, I was in jail for 3 weeks under Saddam's rule. I'm grateful that the coalition forces have come here to help us. But I was in jail because I was telling people on the streets that, they need God. And Saddam didn't like that. Saddam didn't like it if you said you needed to go to any kind of church or any kind of mosque. But then he went on to say, I asked him, I said, well, I see people here who are rejoicing, and you guys are in the middle of a war. He said, let me break it down for you real quickly. The reason why you see this is that, first of all the women in here who are married, half of them do not know where their husbands are. Their husbands have been missing since the war began. That was over a year ago. And the children you see here are playing, they're playing gleefully. This is the only place where they can play. Because during the week, the mothers of those children are keeping their children inside to keep them from going outside to play and run the risk of being abducted or kidnapped by some insurgent and then being sold into human trafficking or some other degrading life in order for them to get money to fuel their insurgency. And the men you see here, the men are trying to protect each and every one of us. And the reason why you see this joy is because persecution produces joy. And I just said, well, how do they make it? And he said, the only thing I can give them, Kelly, I can't give them a program. I can't give them money, although, money can help them with their humanitarian needs. He said, the only thing I can truly give them is Jesus. I was blown away. When that story aired, that was my first story out of Baghdad. And I remember the director in my ear and the producer in my ear saying, oh my God, what an incredible story. And if I've done nothing else in my life, that was probably one of the the best stories that I've ever been a part of, aside from what happened to me in Benin, West Africa, and that was before Fox News. I'll share it with you real quickly. Yeah. So I was invited in 1999 to go to Benin, West Africa, and I was invited by 3 pastors in Portsmouth, Virginia. Well, actually 2 pastors from Portsmouth, Virginia, and one was a pastor from Cotonou, Benin, or some people say Benin. And they're sitting down telling me this incredible story about the transatlantic slave trade. I thought I knew everything there was to know about slaves and slavery because I had interviewed John Hope Franklin during Bill Clinton's, President Bill Clinton's dialogue on race. I was about to be educated and schooled, as they say. Romain Zanu, the young pastor, was told by, he explains he was actually infused with this belief that he needed to talk to his president. And he finally met his president, befriended him, and he never told his president what his beliefs were. Now, Benin is the cradle of animism, it's the cradle of voodoo, it's the cradle of, voodoo is its chief religion. So it's a minuscule representation of Christians, and that would be Catholic and Christians, or Catholic and Protestants. And then they have a large Muslim population. But Karakou was a communist dictator, and when communism fell, he met Romain, but he took his country to a democratic republic. When he met Romain, Romain began to work with him and never told him that his faith was in Jesus Christ. Never told him he was a Christian. And he did that purposely. This gets back to being wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove, or as Charles said, being part of that narrative, and you start to just find out what your story is. And Romain found out his story very quickly because the president began to like him, saying, what is it about you that makes me feel so different? And Romain always responded, not wanting to offend his president, because he knew his president was not a believer. He said, well, I would offend you, but I'm just here to serve you. I like that. And that went on for about 6 months. And finally, the president is seeing that Romain is changing this man, and he says, I can't take this any longer. I've got to know what makes you tick. And at that point, Romain said, at the risk of offending you, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I see him as being the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That president, Matthew Carrick, said, I got to know him the way you know him. And a dramatic thing happened after that. The president makes a conversion, and conversion is such a hostile word, so let's say the president awakened to his necessity to serve something greater than himself. And then, out of that, he learned to serve people better than himself, because he convened a conference after feeling a weight of despair and angst and heartbreak for the misdeeds of the past. Well, what were the misdeeds of the past? And he gave a complete education along with Gerald Rawlins, who was then president of Ghana, that our people didn't initiate the slave trade, but we perpetuated it by selling our own. And not only did we sell our own, we didn't sell our feeble or our weak. No, we left them to die on the Trail of Tears or on the slave route. Just buried them alive. I've been to that place. It's haunting. When you go there, you just feel the emotion of people too sick for the journey, or too militant or belligerent or too defiant for the journey and dying alive. I've been on that journey where they've enclosed people in huts, dark huts, for 2 and 3 months waiting for the slave ship to arrive. And the women being raped and all kinds of other things that took place. And then Karakou saying, you see, what took place here was a dastardly deed inflicted on mankind. I began to relate to that experience and the shared experience of the Holocaust. And my whole mind is just turning around as I'm doing this story. And I'm looking for the title of it, and I'm looking how I can put this together. And he brought it to a conclusion when he said, when he apologized to everyone in that audience. There were at least 300, 400 people there from all parts of the world, because he was brilliant. He invited all the descendants of the slave traders, merchants, buyers, And there were wealthy men standing before us in tears, saying, "Africa, Africa, how we have raped you." I remember one man who was a multimillionaire, and he just broke down in tears saying, "I fear the wealth that I enjoy today was on the backs of the slaves that my forefathers owned in Liverpool." And I'm watching all of this emotion. And then Karakou just says, "On behalf of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, as the president of this country, I ask for your forgiveness. And I pray that we can reconcile our differences and spur a greater development and restoration." Well, that wasn't just for African Americans, it was for people throughout the diaspora, as well as for people of all races. And before I came back, I had a private audience with him, and I asked him, "What do you want me to tell America now that you've done this?" He said, "You tell America that to us, they are a beacon of hope." So I followed up with that. Well, more specifically, what would you have me say to African Americans? He said, and he looked at me in the eye, he said, "You must tell African Americans, never see yourselves as victims. You are victors. We see you as being the modern day Josephs who helped build the global economy we enjoy in the world today." Well, my mind was blown. What do you do with that? You try to tell everybody that you're somebody because of a God who, in the midst of your slavery, in the midst of your degradation, still saw something in you to the point that you could come to a foreign land, taken not by your choice, but taken against your will. And as they told me in Jamestown at this settlement, because I did journalism, he says, "Well, I got to get back to America and tell this story, but I need to go to the source." So I went to the first settlement and asked the curator, "Would this experiment called America have worked without any input from the African?" "No way, Kelly." "Why?" "Well, just so happens they knew how to develop the cash crop tobacco. When England was ready to pull a plug on the experiment, there was the labor, there was the knowledge, and then that continued to go on throughout the entire years of slavery and then the Industrial Revolution." And I thought, my God. So one missionary there from Detroit who grew up in Detroit saw the riots like I saw the riots in Washington. He advised me before I came back home to America. He said, "Kelly, when you have this story, this is a story that's never going to leave you. It's liberating. It lifts a burden off of whites and puts an accountability on blacks." I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "You'll see. Watch what happens when you share this story and watch who resists it." And without getting to further detail, there's resistance. Can you imagine if young African-American males and young African-American women understood their royalty, what that would do for our nation? To define someone not as a thug, but as royal, part of royalty. It's a whole paradigm shift. And I wasn't going to get on that, but it's my story, it's my truth, and I'm thanking God for it. But it's a powerful story. Anyway, the title that we came away with is based on what Karakou said before he went into his apology. This noble desire, this time for healing, and it's stuck with me ever since. So my noble desire, my why, my entire new music project is all based on what June started at 16 after the rape and giving birth to me and then me moving on and through all my flaws, all my warts. I used to have a pastor who said, "Look, your sins, your mistakes, you're going to make them, but God has already forgiven you. You just need to know that. Past, present, and future." He said, "God loves you, warts and all." And then he used to say, His name was Fritz Stegemann, tall German guy from New York. And Fritz used to say, Kelly, how does an orange become an orange? It just hangs in there.
Thank you. True to what I said at the beginning, I want to open the floor for questions.
I didn't think I'm sorry, I didn't leave you much time, but the worst thing to do is invite a journalist, a news anchor who's limited by time and can't talk. And then you ask me to talk about the one thing that I love the most, which is God. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. It was a really great story. Any questions?
Hi, Levi.
Yeah, introduce your name and all that stuff. Thanks, Leah.
Yeah, Micah. Yeah.
And it was fascinating, but it was an interview on CBS maybe a couple years ago, CBS Morning Show, and you were talking about some of the legal troubles that
Yeah.
at the end of the interview, you had the audacity to bring up the unprompted and the hope that you find even in the midst of the hostile environment that you're in the hope that God will use it as a witness to other people. And you brought that up on live television, and I just wanted to know what the biblical narrative you draw from to give you that hope and to give you that witness that God will use that for good in places there.
Well, thank you for that. The biblical narrative really comes from what Christ did with 12 people. What Jesus did with 12 people is that he changed the world. There are billions of names on this planet, but the one name that always evokes some sort of response, where either love him, hate him, reject him, or accept him, is Jesus Christ. And what he did with 12 people was change the world. He turned it upside down. He had a startup company without any social media, without any digital platforms, without anything except foot power and word power and heart power. And he used all of that to speak to people from every strata of life, the down and outers, the up and overs, those people who thought they were elite. He could bring them right down to the common man and say, that man is doing a better work than what you're doing, and you have the money, you have the wealth, you have the knowledge, but you lack the most important thing, and that is the willingness to be humble and to be a follower and to learn and to be a servant leader. So my example was him, and my example was also the apostles, the Apostle Paul when he went to trial in Rome. It's something that he knew he was going to do, and he knew it was going to ultimately lead to his death. Peter, who was also saying, Peter always said, God has already given you everything you need to be successful in this life. And then there was also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I interviewed his daughter, Bernice, and one of the things that Bernice talked to me on the 50th anniversary of his famous speech, I Have a Dream, she said, look, we're all interrelated and interconnected. And my daddy died wanting us to fulfill that dream, and he didn't get to see it. And then I recall, of course, the mountaintop experience that King had just before his death. And then I also recall a conversation I had with Marion Wright Edelman, who was the head of the Children's Defense Fund. And she told me, Kelly, we were on a flight together, and she said, I thought I would have worked my way out of a job, and I thought people would get it that our children need something greater than what we're giving them. And she said, sadly, I'm still working on behalf of poor children. I'm still working on behalf of trying to help children get a better education so that they can achieve greatness and get out of poverty. And she said, Dr. King was going to, they were good friends. She said he was going to die of a broken heart before he was assassinated. His heart was already broken. I said, why? He said, because the people didn't get what he was really talking about a beloved society, about really having a seat at the table of brotherhood. And I thought about that. And then I thought about talking to Nelson Mandela's daughter, Zenani, Princess Zenani. And she was saying, my father was a person who believed in the gospel of peace and was trying to show that. And then I realized 27 years, you're on Robben's Island, and you leave with a spirit of forgiveness. So even against my employer, and I hate to be in this situation, I don't really want to talk about it because it's still public, but and it sounds odd to say that I love the people that I work with. I just don't like what was going on. And I watch what King did. I watch what Mandela did. I look at what Christ does. And injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So I had to do this, but at the same token, I had to do it without malice, because there is no malice. There's just love to try to bring us to a place called brotherhood. And that means we sometimes have to face each other and really deal with some harsh facts. My own sins included. You know, when I'm guilty, I got to go to the mat. I got to go to God and say, look, I did this horrible thing. I need forgiveness, and we all do. But we also need to go step from that forgiveness into reconciling our differences so that we can have restoration. And out of that restoration, we have this beautiful thing called transformation. I hope that answers your question. Kind of deep.
Yeah, that's why we're here. Anyone else? Sure.
Hi, Sarah.
I just want to say thank you so much. Your stories are very moving and motivational. I really appreciate the depth of it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you find them to be motivational. Sometimes with me, I'm thinking, what did I just get myself into? But I'm glad that there's some benefit from that.
The reality of the struggles and finding God amidst such difficult situations is really what truly gives hope.
Thank you. So did you. I mean, because there is a reality of struggle when we're embracing this thing called life. And I want to echo something that Charles said earlier today during his speech, and that is, as he was talking, I was thinking, you know, we have to embrace Christ and then engage the culture. The culture doesn't always reflect who we believe in and what we believe. But when we do it in the right way, there's synergy that takes place, because people want to find hope, they want to find faith, they want to find love, and sometimes they'll renounce the way we do it. You know, we're in a spirit of like there's a lot of persecution throughout the world, and we embrace it and we see it. But in America, it's more low key. It's prosecution, it's antagonism, and so we always have to be careful how we defend ourselves and how we reach out to talk to people. I try not to offend, but I know sometimes the very name of Jesus is going to offend.
Caitlin, yeah.
Mm. 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 That's very good. Not shutting down. There are a lot of times I'm tempted just to say, forget it. You know, I'm done. I'll just go hide under a rock. But then that would make me, and to me, that would be cowardly. It would also be the level of despair that makes me feel that I'm no longer significant. Everyone in this room is in search of significance. And oftentimes our testings and our trials that lead us to significance really require us to go through painful experiences. And we mature through that process. There's a scripture that says, I think it's James, where he talks about, your perseverance, your trials. They produce patience, and patience produces, the peace and the character. And that there's that word again from this morning where we're looking for character. And character doesn't mean that you're without warts. Character doesn't mean that you're without mistakes or sins or bad things that have happened in your life. There are people in jail. I mean, who come out of jail. I just met a guy the other day who's a former gang leader, and you wouldn't know it today. You would sense his sense of passion for giving life rather than taking life away, because of that transformation that takes place. So yeah, I can't give up, because if I give up, then I would, one, be letting you down. I would be letting my children down, my family down. More importantly, I would be letting God down. And I know God has. I like to say that to God, I'm not expendable, because none of us in this room are expendable. God sees each and every one of us as precious in His sight, and He's called each and every one of us to an incredible purpose. And once we kind of get that understanding, okay, so I just fell flat on my face. What do? Do I stay there? No, because a saint is just a sinner who didn't stay there but got back up again. So there's no quit. It's just, and I do feel burdened. Trust me, I feel burdened a lot. And when I'm too burdened, I'll call people up and say, "Hey man, can you keep me in prayer?" That's always refreshing. So I say the same thing to you. When you think about Kelly right from now on, don't look at what I do, look at who I'm trying to serve, and then pray that I meet that goal. Hey, Lewis.
If you were controlling the news today, where would you put the spotlight? Given that people maybe who don't know about, maybe you know about these laws, if you could tell us about where you wish more coverage was given to. If you were
Yeah.
the lights today,
That's a great question. And yeah, you must, you just actually lobbed me a good pass. First of all, thank you for your service. I'm going to tell you that privately, so I'm going to tell you publicly. If I was in control of the media, let's say I had my own show, or I had the ability to put other people in place to have their own shows, my main focus would be on the people who aim high and do extraordinary deeds to benefit their communities. It would be on those fathers who are right there engaged with their children from cradle to grave. Those fathers who are not living messed up lives, or even if they have lived messed up lives, they're turning around that mess to make a better child. That same thing with the mother. Those families, those single parents who are just heroes and heroines out there who are doing great things. Those people who are on the front lines of the opioid crisis, trying to change the whole and make the shift so that lives are saved. Those people are on the front lines of suicide prevention, how they're involved in that life and talking to that life on a hotline or doing something, showcasing them. People who are on the front lines in battle, because we do have battle. Freedom is not free. And usually for peace, you have to have a war. You have to have a war to get the peace, to win the peace. It's sad. The opposite of hate is love. Well, you got to love through the hate, even when people hate you. So I would like to showcase stories like that, showcase a network that's not afraid to go out and talk about this thing called hope, which seems to be so intangible and impractical to news media outlets. How do we market hope? And yet every day, people are in need of that and in search of that. And I'd like to change the conversation. The conversation of left did this, the right did this, conservative this, Democrat this. I'm so tired of that, because it's just the same mantra that makes you more sick and tired of being sick and tired. So I would like to do programs that provide us with healing and perspectives on how we can improve our lives and build each other up rather than tear each other down. And it might sound like paradise or Pollyannish, but the last thing I recall is that the ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people. So if you've got more televisions in the homes of its people, that means you've got more garbage going in than garbage going out. With that one over your head. Think about it. Most homes in America have more televisions than toilets. So you have a lot of garbage coming in, more garbage coming in than going out. Now you got it. Seriously. Because some of the things we put on TV and some of the things we hear and see just pollute us with toxins, poisonous thinking, and really kind of make us cut off society, and then we're only picking and choosing people of like mind, as opposed to embracing everybody in this wonderful, wonderful embrace and realizing that we're all at that table of brotherhood and sisterhood. So that would be my thing. I don't know what I would call it yet. Maybe I would come up with something that would be hopeful, because we need that. We need hope. We need healing. We've been through some things, and it's not that we haven't been through things before. We went through World War II, and we went through the Vietnam War. We went through the Revolutionary War. We went through slavery. We went through Jim Crow. I mean, what's next? But the answer for what next is the same that it's always been. It's God, and God is sovereign, and God bless America. God bless the world. But we should be about the business of being our fathers and minding our fathers' business and being our brothers and sisters' keepers. And that might be a great thing to do.
Good. We're running right up. Oh, Allison's like here too. Okay. I'm so sorry, Andrew. I saw this hand before, so yeah. But feel free to engage. He'll be.
I'll be quicker
in the day, and so.
Quicker my answer. Hey, Tom.
Your answer to the gentleman's question brought me back to something you said earlier. Cal, your perspective and experience in the business of journalism. You talked about people going to bed angry, having heard the news, the extremity and the nature of coverage. You talked about the left marching steadily further leftward and the right marching steadily further rightward. And I guess my question is, because you have the perspective, there's this great middle. If you're moving one way, you're left with a greater group that's sort of in the middle that perhaps doesn't want to go to bed angry. And your answer to that, if you control the media, describe something that a product that could address this seemingly growing larger middle. Is there a marketplace? Would people respond to that? Is there an
Yeah.
economic viability in that? Or do we say one thing and we vote with our dollars and our remotes to the least common denominator?
Well, I think part of it is that we sometimes go to the least common denominator because it salivates or satisfies our penchant for wanting to know gossip and all those rumor stuff. But to the greater good, there is that large middle, and that large middle is just, once we can tap into it and really fill it and sustain it and provide it with, like, I believe in arts and entertainment. I think arts and entertainment can inspire and motivate people. That middle is just waiting for it. And I think if the middle can be satisfied, or the middle, or at least try to meet the middle with hope, the great things can happen. And I like your point. I'll have to talk to you about marketing. That's really a good point.
Well, Kelly, thanks so much. I think we're at the end of our time, but thank you so much for being here and
Thanks
for
for
sharing
having
your
me, everyone.
story. Yeah.
God bless you. Thanks, man.